Hello, everyone. We should be live now. This is Greg Salmieri speaking to all of you Atlas Shrugged fans on the Atlas Shrugged page. And this is episode 26 of the Atlas Project, when we'll be discussing chapter 6 of part 3, the Concerto of Deliverance. I'm going to pull in Ben Bayer, who's joining me from New Orleans, in just a second. I am at my home now in Jersey City. You can see the surrounds and the big Aristotle head, which is behind me. So when it's close on me, you'll just be seeing his beard and mouth. I think I said last week I'd be doing this from Boston today, but the storm prevented me from going up there, and so we've reconvened at my house with those of the New York group that were able to make it out here. Mohammed's a Jersey City local also, and Will's crossed 2 rivers to be with us. So thanks for coming, Will. And my wife, Karen. Ben, you're going to tell us a little bit of about why we're doing this and about the essay contest, I think.
By the beard of Aristotle I am. So this is the Atlas Project. As I remind people at the beginning, usually, it is a weekly chapter-by-chapter reading group of Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged. One of the big reasons we're doing this project is to raise awareness about the Ayn Rand Institute's essay contest about Atlas Shrugged. And if you look in the comments section for the post about this on Facebook, you will see there's a link to more information about the essay contest. You can win up to $10,000 by entering. The deadline for the contest is in May. And so we've just got about 2 months left before that happens. We're hoping more people will get a chance to read the book as part of that. And there's also a link in the same comment section to past recordings of our discussions, if anybody wants to catch up to get ready for that contest. But otherwise, that was the major announcement I had, Greg. You wanted to make a few more announcements of your own.
Yeah, a few other matters of business. One effect of our being at home, where our upstairs neighbor has recently purchased a Chihuahua, is that you might hear some little bit of barking in the background. We're hearing quite a bit of barking, but I'm not sure how much is coming over on the mic. One other matter of business is just here we are in chapter 6 of part 3 of the novel. Chapter 7, which we're getting to next week, is famously called This is John Galt Speaking, and John Galt has quite a lot to say. He gives a speech in the chapter, which is well known and famous, and takes up most of a chapter, and is really a kind of statement of the whole of the striker's philosophy at a very important, I think, plot point in the book, as well as being a significant philosophical essay in its own right. In any case, because this is such a substantive piece and such a big part of the novel, we're spending 2 weeks on it rather than 1. And what we're going to do is, for next time, some of the questions we're going to post are going to focus on the whole speech and the structure of it and the motivation for it. So we recommend people read the speech as a whole. But some of the questions are going to focus on more or less the first half, and we're going to talk about the kind of outlines of the speech, its place in the plot, and the first third to a half of the speech, depending on how you count. Next time in the following week, we'll talk about the end of the speech. So I would say, if you're reading along with us, read the whole speech for next time, but focus on the first part of it. And again, we're going to cover it over 2 weeks. Ben, any other thoughts on procedure to do with Galt's speech for next time?
Nothing really about procedure, but there is a class of people out there who will read this book and skip the speech. And I hope that our sessions over the next couple of weeks will illustrate what they're missing by doing that. So I will just go ahead then and give us a summary of the current chapter. This is the Concerto of Deliverance, and this is a Reardon-focused chapter. When we last met Reardon in the previous chapter, their brother's keeper, he was doing battle to get steel to Minnesota, where the harvest, there was a bumper crop, but there was danger of the farmers and others not being able to get their harvest to market. At the time, this was described as the motive that was still holding him to his job, in quotes. That's page 923 of the Standard Edition. And what happens at the end of the chapter is that basically he loses. The effort to transport the harvest to Minnesota fails. And one of the things that we noticed was that, Greg, your screen is black, by the way. I'm not sure if that's intentional. But another thing that happened was that Danconia Copper had collapsed. Unlike previous episodes where the strikers had pulled off one of their major coups, where Reardon had laughed and then reprimanded himself, this time he laughs at Francisco's project and doesn't reprimand himself. So he's already in a kind of new emotional place. So chapter 6 begins with a series of shady union and government decisions. We find out that Reardon's union wants a raise in its wages. The Unification Board, which is basically in charge of the economy right now, remember Directive 10-289 had forbidden all price raises and wage raises, decides not to grant that raise in wages. And Reardon is then made by the media to look responsible for this, as if then the union would have grievance against him. Meanwhile, mysteriously, we find his assets have all been attached. It's alleged that this is a mistake. They want to get his... they want to apologize for having done this to him. It was supposed to be somebody else. And so Reardon's invited to a conference with various principals of the looting regime, where this will be negotiated. He's also invited to a meeting with his family. He goes to the meeting with the family first. His family turns out to be scared by the attachment order. They're afraid that he might quit, and they acknowledge they've not treated him the best. They ask for his forgiveness, but he refuses to forgive them. Then at the meeting with the looters, we find out that they want to hatch a steel unification plan, just like the railroad unification plan that Taggart Transcontinental has been subjected to previously. Reardon realizes that this plan will destroy him and basically tells the looters this, but they want him to participate voluntarily anyway. When this happens, he makes a crucial realization that leads to his making a decision at the end of the chapter, which we're going to talk about soon enough. As he then mulls over this decision and returns to his mills, he discovers that an armed uprising has in fact happened. Labor stooges who've been snuck into the factory have staged this. They, however, are handily fought off by, it turns out, Francisco, who has organized resistance to this uprising. And especially between having discovered what's happened at his mills and that his young friend, the wet nurse, or Tony, has died in it, it becomes evident by the end of the chapter that Reardon is deciding finally to go on strike. And just exactly why is something we're going to continue to discuss tonight.
Good. So just as a matter of agenda, I want to spend a few minutes, if that, just kind of making sure we're all on the same page about what the looters were attempting here and how the different elements of their plot fit into that. Then I think we'll turn to the meeting with Reardon and his family, and then and focus on what Reardon learns or discovers during that. Then the meeting with Reardon and the planners, and then I think we should spend a little bit of time talking about the wet nurse, Tony, and his trajectory. We kind of omitted talking about him last week, though there was a interesting scene with him, and so we'll pick up on his thread, and then Francisco's role in the reunion that Reardon has with Francisco here. So just to the for the Jersey City, as it is tonight, locals, how are we understanding what the looters were attempting to accomplish here? What was the plot? Any thoughts? Ahmed?
So their end goal was a type of steel unification in the same way that they had the railroad unification. So that being their end goal, it would have been really good for their goal to have Hank Reardon sign off on their plan, to be a part of it, and to pledge to contribute to it.
I mean, it was Reardon's involvement in that kind of a plan is necessary for the plan to happen at all, because it's a plan to, in effect, siphon money from him to the other steel producers. So, were he to go, they wouldn't want the plan at all. But as you were saying, they want his seeming voluntary consent. And so, how do the various things they were doing fit into that?
Well, they're trying to pull off what they did before, the gift certificates, so they can tell the whole country, see, even Hank Reardon is behind this. So you can trust him, surely.
Yeah. And the way they're doing it is we learn, they're creating this this idea that there's a demand for a raise among the steelworkers, which there's no way to tell if there really is. Right, then you'll notice that the first thing they say when pitching the plan to him in the meeting is, well, an essential part of the plan is there'll be no wage raise in steel wages. At the same time, they're creating the impression that there's real unrest among his workers. And that's why they're staging this, I guess, riot, you'd call it, or attack on the mills. And we've seen this is why Philip wanted a job there. They were manipulating Philip to get in and be one of their men on the inside. It's also why the wet nurse had noticed that they were stocking the place with as many as possible of the board's people, the Unification board's people. So, and then they didn't want Reardon to know that the riot was staged, right? So that he would think he's not able to control his own workers anymore also. So that's the plan. And then the attachment order was meant to cut off his means of escape, because the looters are realizing he's at risk to quit. They send Philip, right, to check on him and probe his state of mind, which is part of what he's doing there in the previous chapter. And Philip says, you'll lose him. But they go ahead with it anyway. And they stress to Philip, or make sure he's aware, that Philip will be cut off if Reardon leaves, which is why Reardon's family is now panicky about him quitting, and why it's important to them that they have this meeting with him, and that the meeting happened to him prior to the meeting with the bureaucrats, because that's what Philip thinks will set Reardon over the edge and make him quit. The one other aspect of the looters' plans that I think it's worth our commenting on, and Ben, I think you've had some thoughts on this, is why is the plan to make a steel unification plan? Why is that what's important to them? Is it, or if anyone in New York has any thoughts?
Evidently, Orrin Boyle thinks it's a good idea.
Yeah, so Orrin Boyle wants this. Orrin Boyle wants it because it'll line Orrin Boyle's pockets, but
because he lost a lot in the crash of Danconia Copper, which in turn brought around the collapse of the Inter-Neighborly Amity and Development Scheme he was so heavily invested in.
You're the only one who could keep track of the name of that scheme.
Neighborly Amity.
Yeah, so Orrin Boyle's in a bad way, particularly because he's always in a bad way, but also because of the Danconia Copper situation. But it's not that these people are in principle, they have to help Orrin Boyle, right? It's, Ben, how is it put? Like it by accident adds up to Orrin Boyle's influence.
Oh, that's the idea of mine you wanted to talk about. But before I say that, I want to mention that it's the whole from each according to his ability to each according to his need principle is explicitly invoked at one point on page 980, right after they first describe what this plan is going to do. We'll lift all restrictions from production of steel, and every company will produce all it can according to its ability. And then later, every company will be paid according to its need, and preservation of the furnaces being its basic need, which is what Orrin Boyle gets out of it. So it's not just that they're doing this because they're buddy with Orrin Boyle, but because there's this principle. Now, what motivates that principle is itself an interesting question. And if you look at the, if you look at this description you get on bottom of page 982, top of 983, Reardon is reflecting on the whole situation, and he thinks he knew also that Boyle was not the cause of it or the essential to consider, that Boyle was only a chance rider, not the builder of the infernal machine that had destroyed the world, that it was not Boyle who had made it possible, nor any of the men in this room. They too were only riders on a machine without a driver. They were trembling hitchhikers who knew that their vehicle was about to crash into its final abyss. It was not love or fear of Boyle that made them cling to their course and press. And so the big question is, well, what was it that made them do it? What made this possible? I think we're going to talk about this later tonight. But it's also worth pointing out that there was very similar imagery used back in part 3, chapter 3 in Anti-Greed, where Stadler sees himself, thinks of himself as being caught up in the workings of some silent machine, and he's not quite sure who made it possible or who controls it, and it doesn't seem to have a leader or a center or anything like that. And I think this has got to be significant parallel, which I have further thoughts on, which we may come back to later.
Yeah, I agree, and we will definitely come back to that. The thing we can, I think, take away, especially at the moment from this, is the point, Ben, you made, that there's something about the trajectory of this system or about what's driving them or their principles. There's something greater than the particular influence of Boyle or whomever else that's driving this progression, and that's driving them in a certain direction. But then part of being driven in that direction is that at any given moment, they're subject to various chance influences which will make them favor one party or another as the public to whom things must be sacrificed at that time. And right now it's Orrin Boyle because of whatever pressure he has over these people. Okay, so let's cut to the meeting with Reardon and his family. We've discussed a little bit why they've called him there, right? Philip knows what's being planned. He knows that it's being planned for that evening, and that Reardon will quit rather than put up with it, or is at least at risk of quitting rather than putting up with it. And Philip also knows that the family will be destitute if Reardon quits, because under Directive 10289, all the assets will be seized. There's to be no heirs, right? And so Philip puts his mother up to inviting Reardon to this get-together at the house and really stressing, you have to come today. No, Henry, it can't be tomorrow. It has to be today. Later, Philip screams, mother didn't know, and maybe that's true. So maybe she doesn't know why it has to be today, but it's the urgency is impressed on him that they have to meet today. And he does come. And what is the essence of what their agenda is there? Yeah, Mohammed?
At first, the first section of the meeting, I like to think of it as like a prodding session, where it's kind of like do you know that we didn't get our check, or do you know that we can't pay for it? And to sort of, when he says, yes, I do know, I was like, okay, well, is that because you want it? It's like, do you know that you're leaving us to starve? You never did this before. And then driving and figuring out, well, he's actually kind of down a path they don't want him to be down. He's like almost at the end there. And he kind of cuts them off. And then they kind of descend into, well, we're very sorry. We never treated you the way you should have been treated, or at least not as best as we could have, and then at the end, there's a kind of a section which I like to think of as like, screw you for being so good, where Lillian just really comes out and says, you think you're so good, and she just repeats it. Mm-hmm. And she, at that point, doesn't even care about getting him anymore to help them out. It's just like a refutation or like an attack.
I think that's right. Lillian, and it's interesting that Lillian's the only one who does that, rather than the rest of the family members. They're pleading, but Lillian's the one who lashes out when those pleas are ineffective. And it's striking that the way they do it is starting, as you could put it, with questions, or probing maybe is better than prodding as a word for it. It starts out with, there's one practical matter, and we wouldn't have called you here just about that, Henry, and that doesn't really matter that much. They're not the issue is because of this attachment, they haven't gotten their allowance checks, and now they can't get groceries. They're not starving over it yet. It's not like they have nothing in the pantry. But, it's just a little matter, Henry. We wouldn't even ask. It's just that you wouldn't have let this happen to us before. And now you don't care. And, presumably they're hoping, I do care. Oh, of course, Mother and Philip and so forth. But he's cold, right, and hard. No, I don't care. And I won't sign a credit card with the grocer. I don't want to defraud him by claiming I can repay this. I don't even know if I can. They say the attachment's temporary, but he doesn't really know what it is, he points out. He's tied. Go ahead, Ben.
One other quick thing about the opening of the scene is you get a similar sort of two-faced affect from someone like the mother that you also saw in the previous chapter with Jim. Remember, Dagny had described Jim as both pleading for her help but also longing to stab her in the back. And here we get the look in his mother's eyes was half plea, as if she were begging him not to slap her face, half triumph, as if she had slapped his. That's, of course, in connection with her having been harboring Lillian, presumably against Reardon's will, in the house. Your mic.
That's significant. This is a very different situation with his family, with his mother in particular, that she has Lillian there versus if she didn't. Right now, we don't know exactly how much his mother knows about why Reardon divorced and threw out Lillian, although she probably knows about the blackmail issue at this point because Dagny said it on the radio, although she didn't say that Lillian was the one who told. But she's currently doing something that she knows Reardon was vehement that his wife would get no money, right, that he was throwing her out. And she's presently doing that and doesn't even really make an attempt to hide it, which is interesting. She could have had Lillian, not be present for this meeting. And it's interesting that she didn't. Okay, but I think it's really significant about the meeting that the family recognizes that Reardon might quit. Indeed, that it makes sense from his perspective to quit, recognizes it even before he himself does, and that their agenda is to stop him from doing that. And this is something, Ben, you indicated in the summary before. I think that's really the lens we have to look at this whole encounter through. So we had a question about what it is that Reardon learned. Someone say something? No. We had a question about what it is that Reardon learns in this meeting, and or what realizations he has and how they influence his decisions. Ben, do you want to take us through what some of the people online said?
Yeah, Amber points out that it's finally at this point that Reardon comes to realize that he thinks he never should have supported them in the first place, that he's been, overly generous. Pooja points out that Reardon is now upholding justice over mercy. And that the justice that they used, that he relied on, giving them the benefit of the doubt, is now being unleashed against them. He no longer is afraid of hurting them in the way that he was before. John says, in a related point, that Reardon's coming to realize that they never really offered him anything in value in return for what he's given to them. And as a result, he concludes they don't know how to value him. And that's connected to a point that Ben W. makes, that because they don't know how to value him, Reardon says when they say, "We want to live," he says, "I don't think you do." And at this point, actually also Ben points out that it's here where Reardon is remembering the words of Francisco, "Yours was the code of life, what then is theirs?" And we're maybe starting to get a hint as to what the answer to Francisco's question is.
Okay. Mohammed, you'd want to say something on this?
Yes. One more thing that he learned, and it's something that we were looking for Dagny. We're trying to see if she would recognize it. Remember, there's a section earlier on where Hugh Axton asks her to check that premise if people do want to live. Mm-hmm. Reardon does at least answer it for himself. If I can just find the section, I just found it right now. Yeah. One of the family members, I'm not sure who it is, but said, "Wait, don't go, Henry. Don't abandon us. Don't sentence us to perish. Whatever we are, we're human. We want to live."
Right, so that's his mother.
Right, and then
And his
he's,
response?
well, why no? And then it's kind of like he's realizing, well, they don't want to live. And that's something that
Yeah, so read, if you found that, read that sentence where he says, why
Yes,
not? 'Cause
so-
it's interesting, the description of
It's
it.
like, why no? He started in quiet astonishment that ended in quiet horror. So it's kind of like a, and as the thought struck him fully, I don't think you do. If you did, you would have known how to value me. So
Good, so that puts together some of the points that also, Ben, you were relaying from the web forum. His mother doesn't want him to leave them. After all, we want to live. And he thinks, no, you don't. And he's realizing it, and then this is where we get the point about knowing how to value him. If you had wanted to live, you would have known how to value me. This idea of valuing, using it as a verb, to value something, and that it's something you have to know how to do, is a kind of significant theme in Rand's work. I wrote a whole chapter on this idea in a companion to Ayn Rand. And there's the idea that, but here we get the idea that wanting to live and knowing how to value certain things, in particular the things on which your life depends, and here her whole life depends on Reardon insofar as she's, living at his expense and he's providing everything. And yet she's indifferent to that, doesn't value or care about him. What's the evidence that she doesn't value or care about him?
he says it later on, in that he was willing to forgive all of them for all the past transgressions if they had told him to leave. So, in the sense that I think he sees that there's great danger happening to him, and his family, knowing that danger, didn't really care enough to help him preserve whatever dignity or autonomy he had, but rather wanted to drive him forward actually into the slaughter instead of saving him.
Yeah, so his mother asks, are you incapable of forgiveness, Henry? Is it really true? And his response is, no, I would have forgiven. But the problem is what she's asking for in the name of forgiveness, it is for him to continue harming himself for their sake, which is the very thing that if she's asking for forgiveness, she should have been asking for forgiveness for her demanding that all these years.
And it's the very thing Francisco warned him against.
Excellent, right, and in that very room, right, in the nook, because he's at his old house, right, so in the nook by the window, and he's looking at it, and they don't know why he's looking at that, and he thinks, you who knew it then, and then he stops because he wants to say, you who knew it then, forgive me.
And Greg, the language here is pretty vivid. The way that Reardon's thinking about this setup is they wanted to hold him, to keep him in the sacrificial furnace, to make him let them devour the last of him in the name of mercy, forgiveness, and brother cannibal love. Brother cannibal love is a little hard to get out of your mind. But it reminds me a little bit of something that came up in the last chapter when Dagny is reflecting on the scheme of the looters. And this is even before she goes into the meeting that they invite her to, where she thinks all around the country, each is devouring himself by first demanding sacrifices from others and then being made to be the object of sacrifice. And connected to your point about how there's a connection between wanting to live and knowing how to value, remember also from the previous chapter that Dagny had noticed, while noticing that they were devouring themselves, in effect, they were also evading the fact that this was their goal. And likewise, in this chapter, we see that various members of the family are in this real state of terror. And at one point, Reardon describes them as being pushed toward the edge where to avoid understanding would no longer be possible. And it's worth thinking about what is it that they are pushing themselves away from understanding that would be so terrifying that they don't want to realize it. I think it connects to the observations Dagny was making in the previous chapter and to what you were just saying.
Very plausibly, and to this idea of valuing their lives, right, or loving their lives, because his mother says at the end, what?
Aren't we human? Whatever we are, we're human. We want to live.
Whatever we are, we're human. We want to live, and so maybe what she's trying to avoid seeing is that that's not true, or Reardon's thinking that's the case. Also, in connection to this idea of to love your life or to want to live involves knowing how to value something, right? One other place, Ben, since you mentioned the last chapter, where I think we see some kind of connection. There's such a thing as knowing how to value something or knowing how to love something, and it's connected to wanting to live. We have Galt, right, who says to Dagny that I love you more than my own life, I who taught men how life is to be loved. So one of the ways that Galt holds what it is that he's discovered and communicated to people and to the strikers is that Galt's the one who knows, and who knows better than and before others, what it is to really love your life, how you really love your life. And, we'll hear he has more to say about this going forward. Okay, so let's move on. Speaking of someone who we learn terrible things about the state of their values. Let's move on to Lillian, and we had a question about her. So why don't you take us through what we learned from that?
Yeah, a good amount of people love to comment on Lillian, so we had a good number of comments here. We had asked what it is that Reardon is coming to understand about her motivation, and Schuyler said that it seems like she can't deal with reality except through other people. They give her a sense of her own worth by being brought down. She brings them down a peg and feels superior. Pooja says that something about the way Lillian perceived Reardon's way of life posed a threat to her. And so she sought to gain superiority over him by bringing him down a peg also. And John says her goal amounts to trying to destroy his self-esteem. Betsy reminds us that this is not the first that we've heard about this from Lillian, that she had hinted at all of this earlier in the chapter at Cheryl's wedding, where she wanted to congratulate Dagny for having reached the heights of conquest in the human realm, or at least for recognizing that some people desire that. At the time, she didn't say she wanted it herself, but it was we had inferred that maybe she did. And Amber notices that this is the end of the scene with Lillian, and this is part of the reason why this is Lillian's last scene in the book. Looks like a kind of spiritual death or spiritual suicide, just like we saw happen to Stadler, just like we saw happen for very different kinds of reasons, perhaps, to Cheryl in a recent chapter. And Amber asked an interesting question. She wondered what would have happened if Reardon had given in to all of this, and if he had lost his self-esteem because of Lillian's relentless assault. What would have happened to Lillian? Would she have faced this same kind of spiritual death, or would she have kept on being Lillian getting whatever satisfaction she gets from that? And which I think is an interesting question. I had some thoughts on it. I wonder what other people think.
Let me just, before we follow up on that, just underscore one of the points that you made that's kind of inherent in that question, which is, I guess it was John who said it online, this point that the common denominator between what Lillian was doing is attacking Reardon's self-esteem. Right, and this is what Reardon realizes about her. All these things that he had found so suspicious, perplexing. Why is she on about this? Why is she always talking about how she hates plumbing and pipes and so forth?
What was it, Bertram Scudder?
And brought Bertram Scudder to her house and all of these things. What's it that explains all of that? Well, what she was trying to do was attack his self-esteem. And that explains a lot of things that were kind of mysterious about Lillian, or might have seemed mysterious. Like, how come when he said, look, I don't care about you. You're always saying you don't like plumbing pipes. Why do you bother to tell me? I don't care about that at the end of part one. Why did that really strike her? Well, because it's saying, your attacks on my self-esteem don't affect my self-esteem. I don't care. So this idea that what she's doing this whole time is drilling in, hammering, trying to destroy your self-esteem. That's why she likes the idea of him having fallen into a sordid affair. That's why when the affair turns out to be a great achievement, it really takes her aback. Thank you. So in that context, we now know what she's about, and what she's witnessing is the total failure of this. And that leads her, as Amber puts it, to this kind of death. And so then, just with that really emphasized, we can think about the issue, as Ben, as Amber raised, of what would have happened if she'd been successful. And Mohammed, did you want to comment on that point?
If she was successful, would she have committed the same spiritual death? Part of me says yes for this line, where in discussing her psychology, the author describes it as the lust that drove others to enslave an empire and to break statues. But like what all these things have in common is that you have something that you think is like important by your own estimation, or like you see as good, and then you destroy, whether an empire or like a statue. After that happens, there's really not much growth you could do. Like there's nothing, like you just destroyed something, and there's just nothing else you can do. So I guess you would have to end up the same neurotic way, whether or not you succeed or you fail, because just the value system you have success doesn't mean anything really.
So if you succeed, your success will destroy you.
You're right. And if you fail, then you're by definition you've also lost. So there's no real good thing for her. The same if you destroyed an empire like that.
Any counterpoints to this? Disagreements? Including online, or Ben from...
Well, I'm not sure if I disagree, but it's worth thinking about why is it that she has this little breakdown at all? What is it that has happened internally? What is it that she's realizing that is so devastating to her? I mean, you could characterize it as, well, she's lost, she's not succeeded in destroying him, and so she's disappointed. But that's true of a lot of people in this book, including the rest of the family. And we have been given other descriptions of other members in the family. And remember that line that I had quoted about his mother, that she was being pushed toward the edge where to avoid understanding would no longer be possible. Is it possible that what's happened here is that Lillian has gone over that edge and has come face to face with something that his mother was still able to avoid and able to evade? And what is that something? And would she have faced that if she had defeated him? I mean, maybe eventually that's very plausible, but something about what's happening now and this circumstance, and realizing that he might quit and that they're all going to be without him and their efforts have failed, that's making her realize something is that maybe the rest of the family hasn't, something about herself, I think.
I mean, it's important that we're in the context of this strike that's occurring, right? So if there wasn't a strike, it wouldn't be the case that Lillian's failure would leave her in the situation that it does. So Lillian's destitute as a result of being divorced from Hank. Why is she destitute? Well, because all the old companies that her initial fortune was in, she didn't marry Hank for his money, right? She wasn't super rich, but she had enough money to be comfortable and to be in the echelons of high society where he met her. But that money was all in old stock, and all of those companies are worthless because the economy has collapsed. And Reardon and a couple of other companies are all that's left. If there wasn't the strike, that wouldn't have happened. So even if she had been divorced by Hank, she'd have gone on and still been able to go to her hoity-toity parties and eat and so forth. Moreover, the Philip and the family and whatever would have been able to keep they wouldn't be in a situation where they're facing existential destruction as a result of Hank's leaving. Um,
And
and think about what would have happened to Lillian if she'd never met Hank, and if there hadn't have been a strike, right? She was the hanger-on of this kind of Bertram Scudder intellectual clique that's thumbing their noses at achievement and so forth, and that would have continued hitchhiking on society, draining it, and making the best people in society feel bad about themselves, but not so bad about themselves that they stopped doing enough to produce and keep them alive. And if some particular people did, if say Hank Rearden did or Dan Conway did, and quit and left, there would still be other victims that she could leech off of, other victims that could keep her fed, and other victims that she could enjoy needling and putting down, and do it in a way where her harming them doesn't come back to haunt her, at least not directly. Maybe there'll be a kind of spiritual emptiness if she succeeds at her quest. But
If suppose she succeeded with Hank, right, and like, day after day of nagging, he eventually becomes like a really low self-esteem, shameful person. Would she want to be with him then? In which case, she would, through her own actions, like destroy the purpose of her existence, which is so. In that way,
she might gloat over him then that she's brought him down to this, or if she was so bad and so lowly that she couldn't even enjoy that, she could move on to another host. And,
yeah, Greg.
Go ahead, Ben.
And if you want a good picture of what this might look like, look to The Fountainhead, where there's a similar character in certain respects, Ellsworth Toohey, who also has somebody's self-esteem he wants to destroy, and more or less succeeds in doing it with some possible exception. But because this is a very different society they're living in, where there's no strike happening, the very last scene we get from Toohey, just, who's the next person like this I can move on to do this to? And the radio blares, time marches on.
There are multiple people that we could see Toohey as doing this to in The Fountainhead. Also, there is an example, right, of, Jim succeeds in destroying Cheryl. Not in the sense that she breaks down and becomes evil, but in this, or becomes, resorts to things she thought of as bad, but she decides she can't live in this world, and she runs and jumps off a pier. And Jim takes, there's an element of malicious glee in Jim's reaction to this that's kind of suppressed when he's telling Dagny, it's not my fault, it's not my fault. And there's also the embracing of Dagny as his, next victim. And Cheryl was always kind of a stand-in victim for Dagny and Rearden in Jim's mind anyway. So,
and that's what the backstabbing language is about, probably.
Yes, and that's what the backstabbing, yeah. I think if Lillian had succeeded with Hank, she would have needed another victim. And she would have needed another victim for two reasons. One, she needs someone to support her, otherwise she'll die, And two, she needs what gives her direction in life is the ability to, what her life is about is preying on and undermining people, and so she'd have nothing to do without people to prey on and undermine. But there are usually those people are not in short supply. Yeah. Well,
and in that respect, I've been wondering if Lillian has anything to do with Lilith preying on the children of Eve. Or would that have been something too alien to Rand's education?
I don't know. She doesn't have a lot of Judeo-Christian mythic references, as far as I can see. And where she does, they're fairly vague. Like, so there's, we were talking about after the session last time a little bit. Your Brother's Keeper, of course, is a biblical reference, but there's no Cain and Abel imagery in the chapter, as far as I can tell. It's like she's referring to the term as a catchphrase, but there's not much biblical imagery, whereas there is a lot of Greek mythic imagery in her writing. So I don't know how familiar she was with the details of biblical stories, or if she was familiar, how interested. She, she was from a non-observant Jewish family. I don't know. I don't think she read Hebrew, just as a indication of what kind of religious upbringing she would have had. Ben, do you have any thoughts on this?
Nothing aside from what you said. I think I basically agree, and I've seen people try to dig up biblical allusions in various parts, other parts of the book, which I've always thought seemed forced. Like there's I read somebody once who said that the 3 times that Reardon denies. 3 times Reardon denies knowing where Ragnar is when the cop asks him, "Have you seen Ragnar?" Were supposed to be parallel to the time that Peter denies Christ, but I don't see there was no cock crowing. If there had been, then I would have been persuaded.
Yeah, there are, you can draw a very spurious parallel that someone once tried to calculate on something based on the Kabbalah how many people would be in the valley and so forth. And for anything you can come up with ridiculous illusion. But you're drawing, Will, a more specific illusion that has some literary merit. It's not and so it's not a kind of off the wall connection like that, I think. But it's I just don't know if that's something she would have known about or been interested in. And she could have named the character Lilith, right, if she wanted to make that point. And I guess it's a less society name. So I don't know. So take that for what it's worth. People can see if they think there's a parallel. So Ben, any more you want to say about Lillian's spiritual death and what she realizes or is brought to face with?
No, nothing more. I'll just say this is not the last such death we have in this book. Stay tuned for more.
Yeah, it's interesting that it is different than what we called, or you called that, I think rightly, the spiritual death scene with Stadler. In Stadler, we see taking an action that is sort of the last step of of compromising or killing what was sacrificing what was good in him to what was bad in him, or anyway, the latest step and a big and significant step. We'll see if there are any further ones. But Stadler is somebody, right, who was a great scientist, who was committed to the inviolate mind. That was his highest value. Who had a real love for the people that to him embodied that value, people like Galt and Francisco, and even to an extent Axton, and betrayed it in various ways. And he was put in a number of situations where he either had to go back on that betrayal and admit a mistake and correct it, or double down on that betrayal. And he kept on doubling down. So he started the State Science Institute. He then saw that the State Science Institute was spreading lies and unscientific BS, speculation, in order to destroy a genuine scientific achievement, Reardon Medal. And at that point, he could have put a stop to it at the risk of jeopardizing the Institute, but he wouldn't, right? And then he could have then, when the book What Makes You Think came out, denounced it in the name of the Institute and said, no, we've taken a wrong turn if this book came out, but he didn't. And he could have, when he was now asked to say that Project X was this great humanitarian thing and he was happy to put it in the hands of Mr. Thompson, he could have told the truth and said what the thing was, but he didn't. And so each time he's more and more betraying his mind. But the point is, there was something good about Stadler. What one felt for a mind like his was love, or painfully close to love, says Axton, right? There was a real value there. There was something really good about him and it's not just an accident that it was good about him. He's somebody who did a lot of good thinking and developed himself and became this great mind and really valued the greatness of minds and yet betrayed it. And so the death we're seeing is him kind of undermining, is his being put in situations where he has to choose between the good in him and something bad, and choosing the bad thing and betraying the good. And that's what we see time and time again with Stadler, and the time at Project X is a grand scale example of that. And then we'll see, after which I think there's nothing good left in Stadler. And you could see, even now we've heard Stadler now in, I think it was in the beginning of this chapter, or maybe it was in chapter 5, there was a clip of Stadler where he's now himself spouting the kind of material that was in What Makes You Think You Think. So that's, I think, meant to show that Stadler is all the way bad now. But that's not what's happening to Lillian here. That is, Stadler is now a completely vicious, bad person in the way that Lillian was from the beginning. So what we're seeing happen to Lillian is sort of when the completely bad person gets to the end of the road of their badness and is sort of undone by it. If that's going to happen to Stadler, that's yet to come. But the kind of death we've had of Stadler is the death that brings him down to what Lillian was from the beginning. What we're seeing here with Lillian is a situation in which it seems like she's realized or recognized what she is, and in the face of that recognition is not able to function anymore. And she's now, whereas up until now, she was kind of this crafty, malicious thing who was subtly undermining Reardon and always a step ahead and had her, and was crafty about it. Now she's just sort of brought to a point where she's impotently spewing venom at him. I was laid by another man and so forth. You incorruptible Puritan, I slept with someone else. While I was your wife. And it makes no sense. And he's looking at her like, why tell it to me? Well, wait, I'm incorruptible because you got laid by Jim Taggart? What the hell does that? I mean, so she's, fulminating at him and spewing her venom, and he's looking at her like, what does this matter? And it's the full measure of her failure and indifference, and he doesn't care. This is totally nothing to him. And in the face of that, she's had no victory. Everything she's tried has come to naught, and there's nothing she can do. And moreover, she's about to become, hopelessly poor and has nothing to trade on. So she's facing physical destruction, and all the things that were spiritually non-material values to her, she gets nothing out of them. So that's how I see it. And how is she described at the end of that passage? Ben or Muhammad, or does anyone have the passage?
Yeah.
There's something about the destruction of a person or something.
Her voice trailed off. He had not known what the destruction of a person would look like, but he knew that he was seeing the destruction of Lillian. He saw it in the collapse of her face, in the sudden slackening of features, as if there were nothing to hold them together, in the eyes blind yet staring inward, filled with that terror which no outer threat can equal. It was not the look of a person losing her mind, but the look of a mind seeing total defeat, and in the same instant seeing her own nature for the first time, the look of a person seeing that after years of preaching non-existence, she had achieved it. And that's not far off from the way that Dagny was thinking about the looters having long evaded what it was they wanted to accomplish, and then having actually accomplished it.
It's much closer to what Dagny's thinking about Jim Taggart and the other central planners, and we'll see and of course Lillian is quite close to them, from the beginning as a type of character. So we'll see if something similar happens to any of them. But Lillian sort of can't go on as she had been after this. She sort of reached the end of her road, seen that it didn't accomplish even the kind of thing she was trying to accomplish. She wasn't able to destroy the thing she was trying to destroy. That all she wanted was to destroy that thing. and that she was unable to destroy it. And what she would have told herself, right, prior to this, isn't that all I am is something that wants to tear down Reardon, right? What a destructive, because think of the claim here is that Lillian is someone who's about pure destructiveness. Yeah. But what someone who's about pure destructiveness, or as you put it, Mohammed, is hating the good things because of what they recognize to be good about them, which is the kind of language Rand uses in her nonfiction about this hatred of the good for being the good, or sometimes she calls it envy. She has an essay, The Age of Envy, about this. But that's, kind of deep down what Rand thinks of as the motive behind a character like Lillian is. But, and behind people like Lillian, because she thinks there are people like this. But what would it be like from the inside? What would that person think they were doing or tell themselves they were doing? They wouldn't normally tell themselves, Reardon is good, I hate good things, so I want to destroy him so that I can feel better about the fact that I'm no good, right? That might be the truth of what's happening, but that's not how she would hold it in herself. She would think of it as Reardon's arrogant. Reardon thinks he's an exception to all the rules. He thinks he can flout every standard and things don't apply to him, and he's an exception, and he can get away, and he's so much better than all of us. And that kind of pride goeth before a fall, and you can't be arrogant like that. And think of how he's putting us down by his arrogance and so forth. And why does he think he's so good? And that's the real selfishness of the Puritan. You said he's a Puritan.
He's a saint.
He's a saint, and that's the problem. But there's something wrong with sainthood, and a truly superior person recognizes that there's a higher way of being, which higher way she can't explain or specify. It's non-material, and it involves maybe accepting some of your own flaws or something like that, and therefore not holding yourself up as perfect, since nobody is perfect and so forth, and accepting humility and this kind of a thing is the kind of thing I think she would say. And and the claim is that kind of language or that kind of thinking is, or at least often is, a rationalization for this kind of motive that Lillian has. And now we're seeing it in its full flower, and that Lillian is in a place where she can't but see that that's what she's about, is destroying what's good because it's good, destroying what she depends on because she depends on it. And that's then what she can't face anymore. And this incidentally gives us some clue as to what's going on with Reardon's mother, because Reardon's mother is much more Lillian uses this kind of philosophical, mystical language. The higher kind of person is non-material, and their enlightenment consists in thus and so forth, which you can never explain. Reardon's mother uses kind of more traditional religious language, not clear what particular religion she is, presumably some kind of amorphous Christianity or something, but, we've sinned against you, Henry, and and his mother is sort of less sophisticated than Lillian. But we have the idea that something like this is what's driving the mother or her brand of religiosity, but in a much less intense and virulent way, I think, which is why the mother doesn't go into this kind of,
We know Philip is the same way from a long time ago. When there was a talk at his house about some type of antitrust effort or something like that, and then Reardon's name was not mentioned specifically, and then Philip comes in and says, like, why does he think he's so good for having all these minds or something like that, and so he let slip early on, sort of.
Yeah, and Philip's definitely someone who's been driven by resentment for Reardon. I think that's okay. Is there any?
Greg, we're at an hour in, so I think we should move on to the looters.
Move on. Agreed. So Reardon goes to the meeting with the looters, and we had a question about what it is that he learns at that meeting. So the the way in which it's put at the meeting, at least in some of the editions, is via this metaphor of a lock, right? So there's a lock that's getting unlocked by the different points that are made at the meeting. He's trying to crack it, and the various tumblers in the lock fall into place in succession, and then when the third tumbler falls into place, the lock opens. There's a bit of a bibliographical point, Ben, that you noticed about this time through, which you should share with us before we get into the substance of these tumblers.
Yeah, I'll try not to get too caught up in this interlocking system, but when I was looking at the standard edition and listening to the audiobook at the same time, which I often do, I noticed they used a different word. That the standard edition, the hardcover version, has the word tumbril in place of tumbler, and I hadn't noticed that before. So I checked the original Atlas Shrugged manuscript, and actually originally she meant to say figure, but then she crossed that out, and in the typescript it says tumbril. And if you look up the word tumbril, it means some kind of medieval cart used during the French Revolution, which really doesn't make any sense in context. And so, Greg, we discovered at some point in one of the paperback editions that was still being used while she was alive that it gets changed to tumbler, which seems to be the right word. It seems to make sense. So there seems to be some word choice issue that gets corrected at one point. But
and
on the
what
issue
we're calling
of
the standard edition, and why we call it the standard edition, is it's the one edition. I mean, there's several. The text in the Kindle is mostly like this, though not always. The mass market paperbacks and the hardbacks that are published, all of these three editions are using the original
trade paperbacks.
Sorry,
not
yes,
mass market.
the trade paperbacks, not the mass market, are using, I guess, the original plates from the first edition. So it hasn't changed since the first edition, and that's why we call that the standard edition. It's the one that's been stable all this time. The mass market paperbacks, the little ones, have gone through several different printings with lots of changes, and therefore the pages are different one to the next, and it's hard to find. And the first edition of the mass market paperback still has tumbril, but at some point it changed to tumbler. So seemingly she didn't know the name for the thing inside a lock, was trying to figure it out, settled on tumbril for whatever reason, and eventually it got corrected to tumbler. Anyway, so that's a little bibliographic mystery solved.
To make a point that is not geeking out as much on typography, it is worth pointing out that this imagery of the key locking mechanism is used in an earlier chapter, and I think looking back at it now, it looks to me like a kind of foreshortening. If you look at page 923 on the standard edition, in the previous chapter, where when the scene between Reardon and Dagny, where Reardon's realizing now that they did send somebody after him at the same time as they sent someone to Ken Daniger, we get that the effort by which he made his face grow rigid was almost like the slow, resisted turn of a key, locking a sunlit room he could not permit himself to examine. But as we're starting to see in this chapter, he is now permitting himself, and he's now about to open this door and unlock this lock. And as you say, Greg, by means of these three tumblers in the mechanism, each falling into place. And I take it that part of the imagery here is also kind of like it's like a combination lock. You're listening to the clicking noise, and you finally hit the third number, which is why she was saying figure in the manuscript, I think. And then finally it opens.
I think it's like cracking a lock, like picking a lock.
Yeah,
is the image, because if it's a key, they just all three come in at once.
That's
a different image in that sense, I guess, than the one before, which is a key he's locking, whereas now he's cracking a combination lock or opening it. So, but there's still the idea of there's a certain realization that would be like opening a door or opening a lock. He's doing it by degrees in this scene, and earlier he had been not letting himself do it. I think that's a significant thing. People are talking. We get other comments about locks. Someone's pointing out what timbrels are and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about the tumblers, as we will call them. So each of the tumblers is a comment made, or rather Reardon's response to a comment made, maybe, by each tumbler falls into place when some comment is made by the looters. And let's say what they are. So the first one is you won't go bankrupt. You can't help it. It's in your blood. Or to be more scientific, you're conditioned that way. So this is the context here is they've announced this steel unification plan, and Reardon saying, as Dagny did for the railroad unification plan, this can't work. This is going to bankrupt me. Now, the railroad unification plan was going to bankrupt the Atlantic Southern, as it now has done, and or is about to do. And then Taggart Transcontinental was supposed to get money from them, but it won't because they won't have any money. This one is going to bankrupt Reardon. They work on the same principle, the principle being someone who has a lot of equipment that they're not using gets paid to upkeep that equipment, and someone who has less equipment that's being used is forced to give the money he makes using that equipment to upkeep the useless equipment. Right? So Reardon says, look, this can't work. How are you going to survive? How am I going to do this after you've bankrupted me? And Ferris's response is, you won't go bankrupt. You'll always produce. You can't help it. Is it you won't go bankrupt or you don't go bankrupt? I have won't in my notes, but I remember it being don't in the novel, as though it were like a law of nature. But whatever it was, it's you'll always produce. You can't help it. It's in your blood. Or to be more scientific, you're conditioned that way. So although he's talking the language of science, Ferris's view is sort of Reardon's a thing that just produces. There's always stuff to be had from Reardon.
You have in the notes is right, Greg. It's you won't.
Okay, so it is you won't. But you'll always produce. It's like it's a law of nature. It's in your blood. So why does that comment strike Reardon? I mean, what is said after it's the first tumbler?
He's come to the same realization Dagny already did in the previous chapter. So she's thinking out, the people like this can, when they look at the crops coming in, they can only attribute it to some magic power the farmer has.
Yeah.
Miracle metal.
Miracle metal was another version of that idea. So we've seen this before. Now, Reardon did think in the miracle metal scene way back, they can only attribute it to a miracle, what it comes from in him. But now we're getting this new idea, and I think, Will, you're absolutely right that Dagny had this in the previous scene, because what we're adding to it's a miracle that Reardon produces this, is it's a miracle that can happen in any condition, right? So they see the farmer, and they say, oh, this guy's a source of grain. Grain comes from him. And then they think grain will come from him no matter what, even if you put him in a condition where it's impossible for grain to come from him. And here's something that's interesting, right? Because Dagny and Reardon, from the strikers' perspective, there's something they haven't seen that their strikers are hoping they'll see. Galt certainly is hoping Dagny will see. And it's interesting they get the things in a different order, because Dagny got this point in chapter 5, and yet she's not ready to go on strike. And her last premise left to check, at least according to Axton, is this: the looters love their lives or value their lives. Reardon's already got this, they don't want to live, about his family at least. And yet he's still yet to get this point, as Will pointed. So their last couple of points to fall into place come in a somewhat different order. And the first of the 3 points he gets in this meeting, which all come after realizing his family doesn't value their own life, and presumably by extension other people like them don't value their own lives, is this idea that he's sort of a magic thing that produces. It's a kind of law that they can rely on of nature that he'll produce, no matter the circumstance.
And there were a couple people in the earlier discussion of this who characterized this along the same lines. So David, for example, said that they're treating him as though he can pull a rabbit out of a hat. They've declared he's a magician. And Jesse thinks that they think he's like a genie doing their bidding.
Good. And this, I guess this, at least, I thought the rabbit out of the hat or the magician one was in connection with the second tumbler. So let's move on to that, at least they're connected points. So the second tumbler falls into place when Lawson says, so Reardon says, how do you think this is going to happen? How can I produce when, you're making it impossible? And Lawson says, well, after all, you businessmen have kept predicting disasters for years. You've cried catastrophe at every progressive measure and told us that we'll perish, but we haven't. Now, this, too, is something that happened between Dagny and Jim earlier, right? After all, you guys keep saying this will happen, and Dagny's response is, because I saved you, you bastards, but who will be around to save you this time? There's no one left. And here, Reardon has a similar thought, right? No, they haven't perished, but this is, I believe, where he goes through the people who have perished to make their way of living possible, or is that later? Ben?
I think it's later.
Okay. But anyway, it's later picking up on this second tumbler. So when the third tumbler comes into place, he has a kind of longer process of thought, and he mentions, well, no, they hadn't perished, but who had? And he goes through all the strikers, all the people who had been sacrificed to make their way of living possible, and sacrificed to make their way of living possible. And had been sacrificed by them to make their way of living possible. And then finally we get the third tumbler, which falls into place when Jim says, oh, you'll do something. And Ben, you had some thoughts on the significance of this and the context.
Yeah. Well, it's important, I think, that it's not just the fact that Jim has said you'll do something, because that by itself is hard to distinguish from the first tumbler, you'll always produce. It's that Jim says that in response to Reardon just before having said there's no way to make the irrational work, and nobody responds, and he asks again, what can save you now? And then James says, you'll do something. And so it's this attitude that you'll do something even though it's irrational and impossible. Why is it that they keep believing that the irrational is possible? That's finally making that third tumbler click for Reardon, I think. And I think this connects to a point that Jesse then raised in the discussion, where he says what Reardon's realizing is that he's their enabler. All along, Reardon's been asking, what are you counting on, right? And Dagny had asked that question on a number of occasions too. And remember, like you were saying before, Greg, there's certain things that Reardon's figuring out before she does. And one of the things he's been very good on all throughout the book is this issue of the sanction of the victim. And he's been looking for more and more cases where his sanction is giving his enemies power. And it's at this point that I think he realizes the ultimate one. It's not just that he's helping them materially, right? It's not just that he's working hard for them and giving them the money that they need for their unification plan to work. And this is a point that we've explored in earlier chapters because there have been hints at it in earlier chapters. He's helping them spiritually, as Pooja puts it. He's helping them to evade reality. He's helping them to ignore. He's helping them to believe that the irrational is possible by acting like this magician and this genie who can always create something out of nothing for them. Dagny had noticed something earlier in the previous chapter in that scene with Jim, where it looked like she was helping him to this illusion of himself as the president. But Reardon's, I think, appreciating this point at a deeper level, and he's seeing an implication of it for his own action, which he hasn't seen before.
Yeah, I mean, both Dagny and Reardon have been refusing to grant this sanction in words. Dagny will say, this can't work. I'm not going to reassure you, Jim. I'm not going to help you pretend. But the point that Reardon is seeing, and likewise Reardon, but the point that Reardon is seeing is that by continuing to work in this society, he is helping them to pretend that. And he is letting them get away with this, letting them indulge in this fantasy. And so we say, here's quoting some of his thoughts. Had he cursed these looters for their stubborn blindness, it was he who had made it possible. From the first extortion he had accepted, from the first directive he had obeyed, he had given them cause to believe that reality was a thing to be cheated, that one could demand the irrational, and someone somehow would provide it. So what's happening is that when the looters are admitting the irrational into their view of the possible, to use Galt's language for what they're doing, right? They're creating a situation in which there's going to be destruction. And what Reardon has been doing by saying, oh, we'll just work a little harder, and likewise all the other scabs have been doing, saying, oh, we'll just work a little harder, is they've been taking that destruction onto themselves and to people like them. Therefore diverting the effects from the people who are causing it, and letting them not be destroyed by their own irrationality. And that's why what happens is other people are perishing, not the people who are acting this way. The long range is perishing, the future is perishing, and the best people are perishing, or finding that they're unable to function as the kind of people they are, all in order to make possible this kind of James Taggart, Orrin Boyle way of life. And this brings us to the key realization of this chapter, and of this scene, right, which brings us to where the scene is set. So the scene is set in the suite that had been Francisco's suite at the Wayne Falkland Hotel, that now has been taken over by these planners. And the last time we were in this suite was when Reardon visits Francisco. Reardon's made his speech on the radio already. Francisco suggests maybe he's not fully implementing it consistently, fully consistent in his refusal to grant the sanction of the victim. Then Reardon says, well, I haven't just come to talk about that. And Francisco says, we'll talk about any subject you wish. They talk about Francisco's love life and about the principle of, we get the meaning of sex speech. And then Reardon tells Francisco about how he's ordered some copper from him that he's going to use to keep on breaking the laws. Francisco says, you've been willing to serve them at this price, you've been willing to serve them at that price, now you're willing to serve them at taking the position of a criminal in this society, something like why. And he says, and which of your friends in the copper industry have you given the opportunity of informing on you this time? And it becomes apparent, or Reardon says, it's you, and you're not going to inform on me. And Francisco struggles whether he's going to pick up the telephone and call Reardon to tell him not to destroy that shipment or not. And he puts down the telephone, doesn't pick it up, says hopelessly, Mr. Reardon, because he can't say Henry anymore, or Hank anymore, for the time when you're going to damn me, I swear that I'm your friend. And now Francisco, in this room, thinks back on that, and thinks back on a conversation they had in this same building on the occasion of Jim Taggart's wedding, when Francisco asked him, if everything I said in my money speech is true, who's the guiltiest man in this room? And what does Reardon realize now about the moment on the telephone and about that question? Thoughts? How does he answer the question now?
Well, originally his answer was that Jim was, and it seems kind of obvious why someone would think that. But now that we understand Jim's statement as you'll find some way to do it, as implicating him as well, because he's the one who gives them means to however deplorable their goals, they're not attainable unless he provides the means, and now he sees himself as the guiltiest man in that room.
Yeah, Francisco says each man must identify the man and define the guilt for himself. And now Reardon does. I was the guiltiest man. I'm the one who made it all possible. Because these people couldn't do this without me. They're not capable. And I've empowered it.
And Greg, I think this speaks somewhat to the question I was raising earlier about the machine. What has made this machine, this powerful machine, so powerful? It's not Wesley Mouch or Orrin Boyle. It's not the looters. They're just the chance riders on this system. So there is something bigger behind the scenes here, but it's not being led by some devilish conspiracy. It's Reardon. Reardon has given a transfusion of his own power into the men who oppose him. And
yeah, I mean, there's two elements of it, right? There's this irrationalist philosophy, which Reardon himself doesn't accept, that's driving them. And then that Reardon has given a transfusion of his own power to it. He's made it workable, or made it at least seem to work, so that they can keep on upping the ante of how much they try to, in what disastrous ways they try to make it work. Safe in the view that it will always work. There's this kind of plastic reality where their wishes can be achieved by the magic that Reardon has.
And I think it's not an accident that the same imagery of the machine is used in that scene with Stadler, because even though Stadler's a very different character from Reardon, the same is still true, that he's caught up in a machine of his own devising. Now, unlike Reardon, he's unwilling to recognize that. He's unwilling to recognize the nature of his guilt in this kind of situation, and in fact, doubles down on it. But he's still a genius, and he's given them, not only his moral sanction by endorsing the establishment of this institution and the imprimatur on these books like Why Do You Think You Think, but also he's the one who's figured out this energy equation that's allowed them to build this device.
And deeper, he's given science to the looters. I mean, that's how Axton and Galt hold it. He's the only man of achievement who's been a champion of the looting in this world. So Reardon and Dabney have made the looting possible through kind of passive errors, but they haven't championed Jim, right? Dabney wouldn't have wanted Jim to be the head of the board and to run the railroad. She accepted, well, he can't do too much damage, so we'll let him do it. But Stadler created or led to the creation of and endorsed the creation of the State Science Institute. So he's he's more self-consciously or more emphatically on the side of the regime. But nonetheless, what he has in common with them is he's bringing real value and real achievement and placing it in the service of this destructive regime.
And that, I think, also connects to our earlier discussion about his spiritual death, right? Because if this is in fact what he's done, and he's now, and the result is that he himself is under the gun of this weapon, what is he realizing about what he's done? Probably something pretty similar to what Lillian has realized, though on a different kind of scale. And I just want to give credit to Corey, who said, just like Stadler enabled Project X in the chat slightly before I was due to raise the point. Good work, Corey.
So I think that I want to resist this bringing what's already happened to Stadler, too close to what happened to Lillian in this chapter. I think we're going to see there's another level for Stadler to drop. That's what happened to Lillian here. And Lillian didn't have the place to fall from that Stadler did. Lillian wasn't a person of achievement who sold out her achievements. She possessed no weapon save femininity, and she never sought to develop one. So she never made anything of herself. And all she was doing was, the whole time through the book, was rationalizing that fact that she never made anything of herself by wanting to put down the people who did make something of themselves. Stadler did make something of himself and then sacrificed what he made to himself. And I think what we've seen now is the kind of end of that sacrifice to where it brings him down to the level of someone like a Lillian. But a Lillian prior to her final and full realization of what she is, which then cripples and paralyzes her. And I think we have another rung of hell left for Stadler to fall into. He's done all the work to make him deserve that lowest rung, but we get to see him arrive in it later. Get to that makes sense. I like that's the fun part. But we will see him arrive in it later, and it is troubling. So at this point, Reardon leaves the room. They try to hold him, and he just brushes aside the last of the looters like a curtain. It's easy to move past him. And I think we've discussed, Ben, before, like, what is the moment when Reardon goes on strike? And in a way, it's this moment. Now, Reardon doesn't know there's a strike to join, and there are things he doesn't know, so he's not, like, committing to the cause. But I think he's gone, do you agree, all the way intellectually
Well, but
at this point?
he knows something, right? Because he knows he's got the gold from Ragnar,
Right.
and he's thinking about that in the face of his detachment order. And he knows from previous chapter that Ragnar was one of the agents of whoever it was that Dagny was off with for a month.
And the way he puts it in this chapter is at the very end. If it's true that there are men working to avenge, is it to avenge or to the, or for the salvation or deliverance of men like me, let them find me now. It's interesting. This is right before Francisco comes in the last scene. If it's true that there are men working for the salvation of men like me, maybe avenging is used in other contexts. But I think here I forget what word it is. Let them find me now. You don't have it?
Having a hard time with it. Oh, here it is. Yeah, it's on bottom of 997, 998 standard edition. If it's true, he thought that there are Avengers who are working for the deliverance of men like me. Let them see me now.
So
let them tell me their secrets.
Avenging and deliverance are in there.
Let them come in, he said aloud in the answer to the knock.
Like me, so they're both there.
Yeah, good. Okay, so Avengers and Deliverance. Okay, so he knows there's some concrete secret that he doesn't know, but he knows the gist of it, and he now has the kind of philosophical perspective of the strikers, I think, and you had some good points to make, Ben, about the differences between right before and right after the meeting in his perspective.
Yeah, well, just that it's clear from the beginning of this chapter that he's sort of been building up to this decision. Right toward the beginning, he's described as feeling wistful about his mills, almost as if he had already left them. Then there's the point about the gold that I mentioned. He doesn't seem to really care about the attachment order. The morning of the conference he's supposed to have with the looters, he wakes up with a sense of serenity. When he's driving from his family to that conference, later, he feels inexplicably youthful. And then after the conference, and I think that this is where it really happens, he realizes he loves his mills more than he ever did before. And yet, at the same time, he thinks that if they're existing in a world without certain kind of people, without rational men, the men who've left him, the men he's thinking of, people like Francisco, then they're as good as dead scrap to him. And
this is very much the kind of perspective that Francisco was trying to communicate to Dagny when they were at Woodstock. We see some elements also of Ken Daniger's perspective. I never knew how much I loved it, and Midas Mulligan's in Reardon's bearing now as he looks at his mills. Okay, so two last topics to discuss, and we'll try to discuss them relatively briefly. The first is the wet nurse, Tony. And we want to call him Tony more now because he's a full absolute. He's come into his own. So recall we've seen a lot of growth in this character already. Reardon calls him an ex-pragmatist now, so he showed up as a pragmatist. And this, by the way, I've been sometimes fussy about not calling people like Cuffy Meggs pragmatists, because true pragmatism is a kind of abstract philosophical theory, and we see that's the theory that the wet nurse is spouting. There'll be no ugliness if we don't use ugly words, and it's a kind of intellectual posture that is an anti-principle posture, an anti-principle intellectual position, as opposed to just not being aware of the issue of principles at all. And The wet nurse starts from this, but in a kind of innocent way. He's just absorbed all this stuff and just assumes it and talks this way, almost like he's been reduced to the level of a savage by this thing, and he just doesn't know any better. And through his interaction with Reardon, who he admires, he is realizing moral principles and the importance of absolutes, but can't put the words to it. So he's, I know there are no principles, Mr. Reardon, but don't sign the medal away to them. And boy, you gave them a beating. And what is a moral principle, Mr. Reardon? Well, the thing that makes you sure that I did, that's a moral principle. So he's learning about morality from Reardon, who's in a way learning about it from Francisco. And this comes to a really significant point in the chapter 5, right, where now the wet nurse asks Reardon for a job. And he doesn't want to be a looter anymore. He doesn't want, and he realizes how out of place it is for him to be asking for a job, given how he started there, which is his realizing the full moral import of the situation. And of course, Reardon can't give him a job because he's not in charge of his mills anymore. And he tells him that, but he tells him that he would give him a job. And he notices that that's all that matters to the kid, and he takes it away as consolation. And Reardon notes the thing that it was, that this ex-relativist, ex-amoralist, ex-pragmatist has taken away as consolation. Reardon's moral sanction, right? Reardon saying, you're good. You're somebody who I would hire. You're someone who matters. And at that point also, the wet nurse, Tony, tells Reardon that there's something up. They're scheming against your mills in some way. I don't know what it is, but I'll try to find out. So what happens to him on this day? On the day that's narrated in this chapter. What's his day like?
Well, he gets shot.
He gets shot.
But before that, he realizes he's mad as hell and he isn't going to do it anymore.
Yeah, so he's brought in on the scheme at the last minute and asked to sign some papers to help these goons, more of these thugs, get into the mills, and he refuses to do it. And what is it that he does, as Reardon puts it, at that moment? That's the moment when he sticks his neck out.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. The camera pointed at Muhammad, it goes blank whenever I try to cut to it, but it's there the rest of the time. Anyway, say that again.
No image of Muhammad is permissible.
Yeah. So, there you go. I thought they were talking about the other one, but it turns out it's been you all along. So that's the moment at which he sticks his neck out. And Reardon tells him that. And as a result of him sticking his neck out, he gets shot. He's trying to find someone who'll tell Reardon, and he gets shot and thrown down on a slag heap. And go ahead.
Also, there's a sense in which there's like a connection between valuing something and then like living, sort of having that be the reason you live. And so it's kind of this word symbolic, but it's important that he was willing to get shot. I mean, presumably he knew these were like thugs and these were dangerous people, over saving the mill in the way that he did. And so that sort of valuing the mill that much kind of creates a bond between Reardon, who kind of sees himself in the same position.
Yeah, I mean, he says, so what happens later, right, is he is thrown down, left for dead on this slag heap, resolves that he has to tell Reardon what's happening, or tell someone who will tell Reardon. He climbs, claws his way, dying, bleeding with a gunshot wound out of this heap, and finally makes it to where he meets not just someone who can tell Reardon, but Reardon, who happens to be the one who finds him, right? And he tells him, he's now told him so that Reardon knows that it was a setup, which is, what he thinks will give Reardon the information he needs to fight this. And he says, now I've done it. Is this what it feels like, Mr. Reardon, to want something very much and to make it. And he's never experienced that before. And Reardon says yes. And this is his first time in his life really committing to a value and achieving it despite obstacles, where it's difficult. And then in this moment he's dying. And it matters to him that he's dying, right? And Ben has some points about that we're going to want to talk about. But one of the things that's significant is it matters to him in part, or part of what makes it so precious. He hadn't realized until today what it was to really love life, or how much he wanted to live, or what life meant. And the moment he realized it was the moment when he stuck his neck out. So, and there was other good imagery about the sticking of your neck out. What would have been the point of saving my neck if I had to get it by helping them break yours? And so I think that's
Greg,
that's really significant. Go on, Ben.
Notably, the part about him realizing what it really means to be alive, this is in the same chapter where Reardon is realizing that his family and the looters don't really want to live. And I mean, there's a similar, I think there's a similar contrast that happened in the anti-life chapter between Jim and Cheryl, which if you go back and read, you're going to see that was the issue there as well, even though it only really gets named explicitly in this one. And related to that, I think there's some really interesting imagery when Reardon first encounters Tony on the slag heap. First, he notices there's a scum of cotton swimming against the moon. And of course, the cotton imagery has been used throughout the novel on par with the fog imagery of this is the kind of world that the evaders have created, a world of non-A. But then when he sees Tony for the first time, he thought the voice was familiar, a ray of moonlight breaking through the cotton. And that's somebody choosing to live and to accept reality against, the backdrop of these evaders.
And we're seeing so Reardon said if his family had really wanted to live, they would have known how to value him. And we're seeing some of what knowing how to value means, and some of what's involved in really wanting to live in this character of Tony now, right? So what is it? He's willing to take there are specific values that he realizes are important and needed for his life, and that his life's about. He's not willing to sort of go on at any cost, even at the cost of destroying those values, because he recognizes that that's not a life, and what would be the point of such a life. And we'll think more when we hear Galt talk about this, about what is and isn't a human life, and what it's like to preserve him. But he's not willing to break Reardon's neck or help them break it to save his own neck. He doesn't think that would be living. There are therefore, things he's willing to risk all for. There are things he wants very much, and he's willing to take positive work towards them. And he recognizes that there are absolutes. There are facts that you have to recognize if you want to live, such as human beings can't live if everything's a stinking fake, right? Like the looters are trying to make. And if bastards like that control everything. There are certain facts that you have to recognize as absolute and then try to project and achieve values in light of those facts. That's what it is to know how to value, and that's part of really wanting to live.
But then, Greg, it's worth...
Oh, sorry, Ben, go on.
No, let Mohammed go first.
Okay. Mohammed?
Yes, about the issue of taking risks. I mean, it could seem at first kind of like confusing why wanting to live would necessarily require to take risks that could cause you death, as we clearly see here. But there's kind of this view that's implied that there's certain conditions in which life wouldn't be worth living, and so these risks are necessary in that to that end. If you can just speak more to that.
I was going to say something just about that.
Go ahead, Ben. Then.
So I'm glad he brought it up. I mean, one issue is why is it that the two characters we've gotten contrasted with those who don't want to live, Cheryl and Tony, end up dying? How appropriate is it that the ones who want to live die? And this is something that came up in the discussion, and Tom in particular said it seems really tragic. that they should be put into this kind of conflict. Though Betsy and Schuyler both pointed out that part of the issue here is they're destroyed because of the world that they've found themselves in, that they're both incapable of dealing with the vice and the irrationality that they've encountered. And of course, that doesn't have to be there. That doesn't have to be in a world like this. And I think that connects to the discussion we had earlier tonight about what made the irrational people so powerful in this world. And it's the people it's the good people who've been lending them their power and lending them their sanction. And you have to wonder if Reardon himself doesn't feel somewhat to blame for what has happened in this case.
The significance of the point of the responsibility for this lying on the good people, or some of the responsibility of it, or the most of the responsibility of it, is that it means that this is a solvable situation. If people like Jim Taggart were powerful, and like the other looting planners and so forth, and Lillians were powerful in their own right and ran the world, people with this kind of motivation, then we'd be stuck in a world where these kind of tragic situations happen, and where there's no way for good people to benefit from their goodness, and there's no way for the people who make life possible to succeed and to make life possible on an ever grander and greater scale, and to enjoy what they're accomplishing by making life possible. And that's what Cheryl thinks is the case, which is what leads her to go off of that pier. But if it's the case that this power, these people only have this power because of a mistake of better people, a mistake which they could learn, recognize, and correct, then, as Ben is saying, it doesn't have to be this way. And so there's a way, I mean, the same kind of thing exists not only at a societal level, but in an individual's life. And I was talking to one of my friends about this the other day. If you think that, you have no responsibility for the bad things that are happening to you, you don't feel guilty about them or bad about them because you don't think they're due to you, well, then there's nothing you can do to correct them. What you're thinking is it's a malevolent world in which my life sucks because of forces beyond my control, and so my life's doomed to suck and there's nothing I can do about it. On the other hand, if you think there is something I can do about it, maybe it's not all my fault, maybe it's not even my fault that situations got to be this way, but there's something I can do about it to fix it, well, then you're empowered to make your life better. But on the other hand, there's an issue of blame or guilt to you to the extent that you don't do those things to make your life better. And the whole perspective on guilt in this novel and this chapter is interesting, because there's a way in which Reardon comes to think he's the guiltiest. It's been his fault. And yet, on the other hand, he doesn't beat himself up about it or feel responsible in a certain way. That the import of him feeling responsible for it is, now I can fix it, not and boy, I could have fixed this earlier. But there's not a so I was bad or awful, or beating himself up over it. And you can see it in the reunion with Francisco, right? Francisco says, look, there was never anything to forgive. We're beyond things like that now. And that's part of the we never had to take any of it seriously perspective. Yes, it was, certain things were my fault insofar as it was in my power to correct them. And if I had known that earlier, I could have corrected them earlier. But what's important about that isn't, damning myself or recriminating myself for not doing it. It's recognizing the gravity of that situation and then doing what's good and making things better. And I think that's the perspective on responsibility Rand has. It's not about accepting blame, except insofar as that's an impetus to then make the change to fix things. Mohammed, you wanted to say that?
Yes, because I was also confused about Henry being the guiltiest man. Because usually when we speak about guilt, it's in context of a crime, and the party is someone who should be punished in a way. Like we really don't talk about guilt in society as far as something far away from like punishment. So, but it's not the case that Reardon should be censured or punished or anything like that. And his guilt seems immediately different from Jim Taggart's, and we would a lot of ways say that his is worse. But how could Henry be the guiltiest and yet not the one who is deserving of punishment or deserving?
Well, notably, he's been being punished the whole book, right?
Yeah. So the internet heard you, but Muhammad didn't. So say again, Ben.
Well, Reardon's been being punished this whole novel as a consequence of the things that he's done. That's all.
Reardon's already borne a lot of punishment, and so in that way, there's not an issue. It's time served. But besides that, I think the sense in which he's the most guilty is the sense in which he contributed the most causal oomph to its happening. He contributed the power that made it possible. So all the other, and so in that sense, his causal role has the biggest influence. And that matters because by changing the causal role he's playing, by changing how he acts, he could change what happens. And so since he's the person who has the most ability, the most power, he's the one whose actions make the most difference. And when they're the wrong actions, cause the most harm. And so I think that's the sense in which he's the most guilty, and bears the heaviest responsibility for it. Ben,
Greg, I think we should skip to the final scene at this point, since we have about 14 minutes left, and we should probably quit before that.
By the final scene, you mean the scene with Francisco. Or do you want not the discussion of the boy? Okay,
we can keep
Tony.
That for later.
All right, and if we do have a supplemental section, so it might be that I go up to Boston still. We're still planning on going up tomorrow, in which case we'll meet with some of the Boston people if they want to, and maybe we'll discuss that on the supplemental scene. Okay, but there is some more to say about the scene with Tony, and but yeah, let's hold that. So jumping then to Francisco. Ben, do you want to tell us about what we got from the question on him about his role in the chapter?
Yeah, we got some good stuff from people. So we had asked a question: what role does Francisco play in this chapter? And I mean, the most obvious is that he shows up at the end, but I think almost everybody who commented noticed that this was not the only role that he played. That his presence has been felt really throughout this entire chapter. We've already mentioned a few of the cases where Reardon has remembered one thing or another that Francisco said. Schuyler says that Francisco is the voice of reason and spirit and a superhero in the physical sense. He calls Francisco an uncaped crusader, which I like because actually the way the writing is that she actually describes it. He's not wearing a cape, but he might as well be when he comes in at the end. Greg P. says that he saves Hank physically by protecting him against the thug and spiritually by giving him a template for shrugging off the looters. We've been looking at that template tonight. The point about, Anna actually mentions part of it. She says specifically he remembers Francisco's warning about the sin of forgiveness and his insistence that he is his friend. That is material, spiritual fuel that he uses when he refuses his family. In that same scene, I should mention also that he's also remembering how Francisco took such a lashing from Reardon in the scene where they are together with Dagny, and he's wanting there desperately to be forgiven by Francisco, but not willing to forgive his family. David points out that Reardon's now coming to see his mills in the way that Francisco saw his mines, and we know, of course, that Reardon had reacted to the destruction of Danconia mines, by laughing in kind of a benevolent way. And then we've discussed thoroughly the point about how Reardon is realizing that he indeed was the guiltiest man in the room. which is a point that has been suggested to him by Francisco. This is part of what allows him to make the final decision to quit at the end. And you really see it, I think, in the line where he realizes that upon realizing that he was the guiltiest man, that this is the answer to all the devastation he had witnessed through the years of his life. And I think that speaks somewhat to the question that Muhammad was asking about, what about punishment? Well, he's realizing I have inflicted all this punishment on myself, and it's always been a huge mystery to me why this is. And now, like you're saying, Greg, the problem seems solvable.
Good. Anything we want to add about their actual meeting? So Francisco, as you said in the summary, is the one who organizes the mill workers to resist the people who want to come in and basically kill them and start a fight there.
Frank Adams, at least, does.
Frank Adams. Muhammad is the Antifa of the novel. Francisco's quite a marksman, as we might expect, since he's good at everything. He saves Reardon's life. So then we get this scene, if there are Avengers working for the salvation of men like me, somebody pointed out that that's religious imagery, which I think it is. So is Deliverance in the chapters, the Concerto of Deliverance. Let them find me now. Francisco is the one who comes in and finds him. And Ben, any thoughts on this last scene between Reardon and Francisco?
I don't have any more that we haven't already talked about, except...
there's the little beautiful touch of things like, you have a lot to tell me, but first I have a lot to tell you, says Francisco, but first I want to ask you again for a word that you once offered me, but I had to reject. Reardon says, what is it, Francisco? Right?
What word, Francisco?
Yeah, good. What word,
Which is
Francisco?
ambiguous, because at first you think he's asking, what word is that, Mr. Francisco? But actually saying, what word, Francisco? And that was the word.
Yeah. So this is the one thing that I really enjoy in the interaction between these two characters that doesn't read the same now as it must have at the time, or as it does when you put yourself in the world of the novel, is the strong distinction between referring to people by first and last names. And you get that in the relationship with Galt and Dagny, where she always refers to him as Mr. Galt until the post-coital moment where she refers to him as John, and he's Miss Taggart, until then. And likewise, Hank and Reardon get on a first name basis very briefly, but then he has to reject it because he's about to send his copper to the ocean floor. So there's that. I think that's just a beautiful moment, and I just like how that works literarily. There's also this discussion of guilt and forgiveness in this scene, which we already mentioned. Reardon wants Francisco's forgiveness, but there's nothing to forgive, and don't you see that now? And yes, of course he does. And we've already had this issue with Dagny and Francisco, where Dagny's recognized there might be a day she'd beg Francisco's forgiveness, and then she actually does when she gets to the valley. And he says, well, I won't forgive you yet. There's nothing to forgive, but, when you join us. And so we're seeing that moment between Reardon and Francisco, whereas there's this kind of guilt, and yet there's nothing to forgive, because when you see the truth, there's kinds of salvation or cleansing, and these issues then cease to matter in that way. And that's, again, this religious kind of imagery. One thing I think we should do at some point, we're going to have some sessions, I think more than one, Ben and I are talking about how to plan them, after we're done with the whole novel, kind of reflecting on themes throughout. And I think one of the things we should talk a little bit about is the use of religious terminology and imagery and what the significance of that is. I think anything else we want to comment about then, about the ending of the chapter?
Not about the last scene, but I thought there was this really good question.
Hold on, so Will wants to say something, and then we'll get to what you were going to say,
ahead.
Ben. Well,
Yes, in Anti-Life, where Lillian says if you bashed Reardon of a club, he just blamed himself for not getting out of the way. And now somebody does bash him with a club, but he's much too busy to worry about who to blame for it.
yes, I think that's
I never
a good
noticed
point.
that.
he sees fully in the face of the guy who bashes him with the club what the nature of this society is, and then he's ready for the Avenger, for Francisco. Ben, what was your closing point going to be?
Last thing I was going to talk about briefly was I thought Pooja asked a really good question under question 6 about whether the Halley Concerto is referenced at all in this chapter. It's, of course, the Concerto of Deliverance, and I hadn't thought about that myself. There aren't any overt references to it, which is probably why she's wondering. And you wouldn't expect there to be, because we don't ever get the story that Reardon is a big classical music fan, like Dagny is. Nevertheless, for Dagny at least, that piece is described as having a certain kind of abstract meaning, and clearly he's being delivered from evil in this chapter. And I dug a little deeper, and some of the scenes where he's driving away after having made his decisions, there's language in them that I think there's parallels to the same kind of feelings that Dagny's feeling when she's hearing the concerto for the first time. So, for example, in the very first scene of the book where we meet her and she's hearing the brakeman whistling it, she's described as thinking that it had a freedom of release and the tension of purpose. It swept space clean and left nothing but the joy of an unobstructed effort. And she's laughing. It's speaking in laughing astonishment at the discovery that there was no ugliness or pain, and there never had to be. Well, we've kind of talked about that. And Reardon then, when he's driving from his family, is feeling a sense of extreme precision and of relaxation, together a sense of action without strain, which seemed inexplicably youthful. What he now felt was like the simple, astonished question, why should one ever have to act in any other manner? I mean, this is basically the same idea. And likewise, Dagny's thinking that this is the time where it's time for just a few moments to let go, drop the controls. This is it. Forget everything and permit yourself to feel. Likewise, when Reardon is driving away finally from his meeting with the looters, where he's definitely made the decision, he's described as thinking he could now afford to rest with no further activity of soul. It was as if, by an effort of years, he'd climbed a mountain to gain a distant view, and having reached the top, had fallen to lie still, to rest, before he looked free to spare himself for the first time. So this is not the musical Concerto of Deliverance, but it's the sense of life that musical work was embodying for Halley and for Dagny, at least in a moment, but now for Reardon, hopefully for a while.
And we're seeing the specific themes of the concerto, as you're pointing out. So it's not just they're both deliverance, but a lot of the specific language to describe how that theme is developed. We're getting. One other thing I just want to acknowledge, Corey made a really good point, I think it was Corey, in the chat just now, which is that the stuff we were talking about the perspectives on guilt and responsibility, is very much the same kind of material, the same kind of perspective on guilt and responsibility that we discussed in connection with the train sequence there. So in a way, all the passengers on the train were guilty or responsible for what happened to them. If Reardon is the guiltiest man in the room, Reardon is the most responsible for what happened to them and to the world in this way, though for somewhat different
saw that
reasons.
comment, and I think it's a good point, though. It's worth noting there is, of course, one big difference, and that is that Reardon is guilty without the same characterological flaw that it seems many of the characters on this train have. That is, they've actually accepted some of the ideas that have led to this destruction. Reardon's been rebelling against them and not realizing that he's been helping them inadvertently.
Well, yes and no, but hadn't he too accepted it? The killer premise that draws a wedge between your mind and your body, thinks Reardon himself even in that scene. So he had accepted some of their tenets. Dagny, I think, has in a way accepted none of them. And I think in a way that's why Dagny and Galt are closer characterologically. But the essential point is right, though, that Reardon's guilt is not primarily through his accepting evil ideas for the reasons that these other people accept them, to rationalize away some bad thing about them, but rather was innocent or more innocent. Although even there's the issue of Francisco saying that Reardon is evading or pushing thoughts out of his mind for a more noble reason. So we'll have occasion to talk a lot more about these issues of responsibility, these issues of valuing or loving your life, these issues of good and evil and the psychological and mental mechanics of it when we hear Galt's longer exposition on these topics, which is the next chapter. We're going to start talking about it next week, and the material that's particularly germane to what I think we're saying right now will be in the what we'll talk about 2 weeks from now. So thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to see if I can get online again from Boston with some of the Boston people, and maybe we'll have occasion to discuss some topics we didn't hit tonight concerning Tony and so forth. Then I can tell you a little bit about the literary story behind that character. And but if not, and if so also, we'll see you guys all next week. I'll be back in our regular New York location. Ben in New Orleans as always to discuss the beginning of Galt's speech. And Ben, you'll be joining us live in New York the following week, right?
Yeah. So everyone tune in March 20th. Listen to Mr. Salmieri discuss a report on the world crisis.
Or Dr. Salmieri and Bayer, as it is. All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks, and we'll be with you next time.
Good night.